What if women over 40 aren't going crazy at all, but are finally waking up? And what if families aren't breaking apart, but being forced to confront truths they've ignored for decades? They say women over 40 go crazy. That single sentence has ruined more relationships than we're willing to admit. Because the moment behavior is labeled as madness, curiosity dies, listening stops, understanding becomes unnecessary, and psychology is replaced by judgment. But here's the uncomfortable truth: nothing sudden is happening in the female mind at 40. What's happening is delayed expression. For decades, many women are psychologically trained to prioritize stability over authenticity. Be agreeable, be patient, be flexible. Don't ask for too much, don't feel too deeply, and most importantly, don't change. This conditioning doesn't erase desire, anger, ambition, or grief. It simply pushes them underground. The mind keeps score. By the time a woman reaches her 40s, her psyche has accumulated years of emotional debt, unspoken resentment, deferred dreams, identity compromises that once felt temporary but slowly became permanent. And the brain has a limit. What society calls crazy is often the moment the mind says, I can't keep pretending anymore. Psychologically, this is not breakdown, it's breakthrough under pressure. Neuroscience tells us that midlife is a period of intense cognitive reassessment. The brain becomes less tolerant of contradiction. You can't tell yourself comforting lies as easily. The gap between who you are and who you've been performing becomes impossible to ignore. That tension creates visible change. Suddenly, she questions things she once accepted. She reacts faster, sharper, louder. She stops smoothing conflicts that exhaust her. She starts naming discomfort instead of swallowing it. And from the outside, this looks alarming. Families say, she's not the same person. Partners say she's become irrational. Society says something is wrong with her. But psychology asks a different question. What if something was wrong before, and now it's finally being addressed? The myth of going crazy exists because emotional awakening is inconvenient to systems that benefited from silence. When someone changes internally, it destabilizes relationships that were built on predictability rather than mutual growth. The mind doesn't unravel overnight, it reveals. Think about this: if someone suppresses pain for 20 years, would you expect the release to be quiet, polite, easily digestible? Of course not. Emotional compression leads to emotional intensity. This is why reactions feel extreme. Not because they are irrational, but because they carry years of unprocessed experience. The argument isn't about today. The tears aren't about this week. The anger isn't about that one comment. It's about everything that was never addressed when it should have been. Labeling this as crazy is a defense mechanism. It protects others from having to examine their role in the emotional ecosystem. It avoids accountability. It keeps the narrative simple. But the mind is never simple. Psychologically speaking, midlife forces identity confrontation. The question is no longer, what do I need to do, but who am I when no one is watching, and do I recognize myself? That question terrifies people who have built their sense of safety around consistency, because growth threatens comfort. So the myth survives. Women aren't going crazy. They're colliding with the truth of themselves, and truth is disruptive when it arrives late. The mind doesn't ask permission when it's ready to be heard. It doesn't care if the timing is inconvenient or if others prefer the old version. Once awareness begins, suppression becomes more painful than conflict. And that internal shift, misunderstood, mislabeled, and dismissed, is where the myth begins, where misunderstanding deepens, and where the real psychological story starts unfolding. Long before anyone notices the change, it begins quietly. Not in behavior, not in words, but in identity. From an early age, many women learn that who they are is negotiable. Their needs are adjustable. Their emotions are flexible. Their dreams can wait. And over time, this negotiation becomes a habit so deep it feels like personality rather than survival. Psychologically, this is called identity suppression. But in real life, it looks like being easy to live with, understanding, or strong. Strength becomes endurance. Endurance becomes invisibility. Every time a woman chooses peace over truth, something inside her takes note. Every time she dismisses her own disappointment to keep harmony intact, another emotional bill is added to the account. These moments don't disappear. They accumulate. This is emotional debt, and like all debt, it compounds with time. In her 20s and 30s, the cost feels manageable. There's energy. There's hope that things will change naturally. There's the belief that sacrifice is temporary and appreciation will eventually arrive. But the psyche is patient only up to a point. By midlife, the emotional system begins to audit itself. The mind starts asking questions it avoided for years. Who did I become for everyone else? What parts of me were never allowed to grow? Which versions of myself were slowly abandoned to keep everything running smoothly? These questions are not gentle. They don't whisper. They surface with urgency because the unconscious knows time is no longer infinite. What looks like sudden dissatisfaction is actually delayed awareness. The suppressed self doesn't knock politely. It arrives with force because it has been ignored for decades. This is why the emotional expression feels disproportionate. The reaction is not responding to one moment, but to a lifetime of moments that were never honored. This is where relationships feel the shift most intensely. Partners often say, "You never complained before. Children say, "You've changed." Family members say, "Why now?" But psychology understands something crucial: silence is not consent. Compliance is not fulfillment. Endurance is not happiness. The woman who held everything together did so by holding herself back. That restraint required constant psychological effort, monitoring emotions, editing reactions, managing others' comfort. Over time, this self-regulation becomes exhausting. The nervous system cannot sustain it forever. Eventually, the cost of suppression outweighs the cost of conflict. And when that balance tips, the suppressed identity begins to surface. She starts wanting things without apology. She starts expressing anger without cushioning it. She starts questioning roles that once defined her. To the outside world, this feels like betrayal. To the psyche, it feels like survival. Emotional debt demands payment. Every unspoken need, every dismissed boundary. Every time she chose to be less so others could feel more, it all comes due at once. And when it does, the release is messy, unfiltered, and impossible to ignore. This is not regression. It's retrieval. The mind is reclaiming what was postponed. The identity that was fragmented is trying to reassemble itself. And reintegration is always chaotic before it becomes stable. What makes this stage so misunderstood is that people mistake emotional honesty for emotional instability. But instability is pretending nothing hurts when everything does. Honesty is finally acknowledging the damage. Suppressed identity doesn't disappear, it waits. And waiting creates pressure. By the time it surfaces, it doesn't want compromise. It wants recognition. It wants space. It wants legitimacy. And if those around her only recognize the version of her that was convenient, the conflict intensifies. Because now, the psychological task is no longer maintaining relationships at any cost. It is maintaining the self. This shift feels threatening to systems that relied on her emotional labor without questioning its toll. When the emotional caretaker stops caretaking herself last, the structure shakes. Not because she is breaking it, but because it was built on her silence. Emotional debt is not punishment, it's accounting. And when the mind finally opens the ledger, it stops negotiating with denial and starts demanding truth around midlife. Biology and psychology collide in a way that is impossible to ignore. Hormonal changes are real, estrogen fluctuates, progesterone drops, cortisol sensitivity increases, sleep patterns shift. Emotional regulation feels different, but reducing everything to hormones alone is a convenient oversimplification that misses the deeper truth. Hormones don't create meaning crises, they remove emotional filters. For years, many women biologically tolerate imbalance through resilience. The body adapts, the mind compensates. But as hormonal transitions begin, that tolerance weakens. Emotional numbing fades. What once felt manageable now feels unbearable, not because it suddenly became worse, but because the body no longer cushions the impact. This is where existential awakening enters the picture. At this stage of life, time becomes visible, not abstract, not theoretical, but personal. The future is no longer endless. The past becomes heavier than expected. The question shifts from "what should I do next?" to "what did I actually live?" This realization doesn't arrive gently. It comes in flashes, in moments of stillness, in unexpected waves of sadness, anger, or restlessness that seem to have no clear trigger. And people around her mistake this intensity for instability. But psychologically, this is meaning recalibration. The mind is reassessing the narrative it has lived by, the roles it accepted, the sacrifices it justified, the promises it believed would pay off later. And when those promises remain unfulfilled, the psyche reacts, not with calm reflection, with urgency. Hormonal shifts amplify this urgency by reducing emotional suppression. The internal voice that was once quiet becomes impossible to mute. Thoughts feel sharper. Emotions feel closer to the surface. Patience wears thin, not because she is losing control, but because she is losing tolerance for self-betrayal. This is why the awakening feels disruptive. She begins to question the life she built, not because it is objectively wrong, but because it may not be true to who she is now. And the mind cannot unknow what it knows. The existential layer deepens when she realizes that many choices were made in survival mode. Not freedom, not authenticity, survival, stability, approval. That realization hurts. Grief surfaces for versions of herself that were never explored. Paths not taken, desires postponed indefinitely, dreams minimized until they disappeared. This grief doesn't follow a neat timeline. It arrives unexpectedly, mixed with anger and regret. And hormonal sensitivity intensifies it. What others perceive as emotional volatility is often unresolved grief finally finding expression. The tears don't always make sense. The frustration feels disproportionate. The restlessness has no clear destination. But internally everything connects. The body is no longer buffering emotional truth. The mind is no longer willing to delay reckoning. And together they force a confrontation with reality. This confrontation threatens established dynamics. When a woman begins questioning meaning, everyone around her feels it. Because meaning is contagious. It destabilizes routines that depend on unquestioned participation. It disrupts roles that require emotional availability without reciprocity. Partners may say she's overthinking. Family members may say she's ungrateful. Society may say it's a phase. But existential awakening is not a phase, it's a psychological milestone. It marks the transition from living on autopilot to living with awareness. And awareness is uncomfortable before it is liberating. Hormones don't cause this awakening, they expose it. They remove the emotional anesthesia that once made dissatisfaction tolerable. They force honesty in the body and the mind at the same time. This is why the change feels non-negotiable. Once the illusion of endless time disappears, the psyche demands alignment. It no longer accepts someday. It wants now. It wants truth. It wants congruence between inner reality and outer life. And when that alignment is missing, tension escalates. She may feel restless without knowing why, angry without a clear target, sad without a specific loss. These emotions confuse those around her, but internally they are signals. Signals that the life being lived is out of sync with the self that has emerged. Existential awakening doesn't ask politely. It doesn't wait for permission. It doesn't prioritize comfort. It forces reevaluation because the mind understands something the environment often resists. That time awareness and identity have converged. And once they do, there is no returning to emotional sedation, no unseeing the gaps, no shrinking back into roles that no longer fit, no silencing questions that now feel necessary, no pretending that fulfillment can continue to be postponed, no denying the internal shift that has already begun, no separating biology from meaning when both are speaking at once. Keynote 4: expand it up to minimum 100 words, and do not add any ending sentence. Writer's video script that engaging audience. Keynote 40: why families feel the shock. When one person or family changes internally, the entire system feels it. Families are not just emotional connections, they are psychological agreements, unspoken roles, predictable behaviors, silent expectations about who gives, who absorbs, who adapts, and who remains comfortable. For years, many families stabilize themselves around one person's emotional flexibility, and very often that person is the woman. So when her internal transformation begins, the system experiences it as a threat, not because she is attacking the family, but because she is no longer performing the role that kept everything balanced. The emotional mediator starts expressing her own needs. The peacekeeper stops smoothing over conflict. The one who absorbed tension begins returning it to where it belongs. This feels like chaos to those who relied on her emotional labor. Children feel unsettled because the emotional atmosphere changes. Partners feel destabilized because the old responses no longer work. Conversations that once ended in silence now continue. Boundaries appear where access used to be unlimited. From the inside, she is becoming more honest. From the outside, the family feels like it's losing stability. But stability built on one person's suppression is fragile by design. Families often mistake discomfort for destruction. They interpret emotional restructuring as breakdown. But psychologically, what's happening is exposure. Hidden imbalances surface. Unresolved dynamics become visible. Old patterns lose their power because the person who sustained them no longer consents unconsciously. This shock is not caused by her change alone. It's caused by the system's resistance to adapt. When families demand that she return to who she was, they are not asking for peace. They are asking for silence. And silence is what allowed imbalance to survive for so long. As her boundaries become clearer, the emotional cost of ignoring reality rises. The family must either evolve with the change or attempt to suppress it, and that tension is where conflict intensifies, where misunderstandings grow, where fear replaces familiarity, where love is tested by truth, where comfort resists growth, where roles dissolve, where old agreements no longer apply. This entire story was never about women going crazy. It was about what happens when a human mind is pushed into silence for too long and finally refuses to stay there. What looks like chaos is often clarity arriving late. What looks like destruction is often truth disrupting comfort. What looks like a family breaking apart is often a system being forced to reveal its weaknesses. When identity is suppressed, emotional debt accumulates. When hormones remove the filters, awareness sharpens. When awareness grows, old roles collapse. And when old roles collapse, anyone who benefited from them feels threatened. The real danger is not change. The real danger is misunderstanding change. Because when we label awakening as madness, we punish honesty. When we call boundaries selfishness, we reward imbalance. When we demand people remain who they were, we deny who they are becoming. This is not a gender issue, it is a psychological one. Growth is disruptive when it arrives in systems that never planned for it. But disruption is not the same as destruction. Sometimes it is the only path